I have long been fascinated by the story of Jesus feeding thousands of people when he applied the meager resources that were immediately available to him. That was 2 small fish and 5 barley rolls. And then he applied those in an act of faith. See Matthew 14, verses 17 through 21. While I make no claim to be an artist, the inspiration of that Bible account motivated me to try my hand at painting the scene. With significant help from my mother and my daughter, the painting was completed and has for years now been displayed in a local church. The picture painted by Matthew's account of this miraculous feeding begins with this explanation that Jesus had just learned of the murder of his cousin John the Baptist. Jesus was distraught, and Scripture says he sought to retreat to a solitary place, but the masses of people followed. They hungered for the message that only Jesus could provide. A parallel is seen today. The church grieves the murder of infants in utero, grieves the destruction of the family unit, grieves the distortion of marriage and the deterioration of moral standards and the rejection of truth. In their distress, many churches simply attempt to withdraw. They avoid active involvement in the issues that are affecting the culture. They preach the salvation message, but take a hands-off approach to social issues of the day. Churches, by and large, reject participation in government or in politics, ignoring Christ's call for believers to act as salt and light, influencing the culture. But the public is hungry. We see a surge, for example, of young people entering the church, influenced perhaps by the assassination of Charlie Kirk or the crumbling morality in this world. They clamor for truth. They need to be spiritually fed. In an attempt to avoid the weighty responsibility of guiding the ecclesia, many church leaders leave it up to their congregants to forage for truth on their own. Clergymen shun discussions about abortion, marriage, family, or God's standards of truth that are being misapplied in the halls of the legislature every day and likewise being abused in social commerce. The story of Jesus miraculously feeding thousands by faithfully using the resources that were immediately available sets an example for the modern-day church. The disciples encouraged Jesus to send the people away so that they could find nourishment on their own. That's Matthew 14:15. Providing food would be too costly, they said. But Jesus had a different plan. They don't need to go away, he said. You give them something to eat. That's Matthew 14, verse 16. Feeding the masses who are clamoring for God's truth would be costly. If we openly discussed God's long-standing anger concerning infant sacrifice, for example, and then applied that to abortion, the abortion movements that are going on in the General Assembly, legislative bodies today, some people might become offended. If we advocated in church that marriage is between one man and one woman, as Jesus taught, see Matthew 19:4 and 5, surely Satan and his followers would object. Like the approach adopted by the disciples prior to Jesus feeding the masses, many suggest that the loving thing to do is simply release the people so that they can sort out spirituality by themselves, and so they can negotiate social movements affecting the daily life on their own. They suggest let them discern their own truth. The church, they say, should not be engaged in politics or the decaying culture, even though that would directly conflict with Jesus' directions in Matthew 5:13 and 14. They suggest that the stench of being salt poured into the decaying culture might be offensive to the holiness of the church. They argue there could be division. Yes, but division was promised by Jesus Read Matthew 10:34 through 36. And what's more, they contend that the church lacks the resources to engage against the bloated coffers of the current political system. But Jesus says, in effect, bring them what you have. Use that to feed the people. See Matthew 14:18 through 20. While the human desire is for the church to retreat and send the masses out to fend for themselves, Jesus counters with explicit directions. You feed them, he says, Matthew 14:16. The church may be distraught by society killing God's standards for living, but that's not an excuse to avoid issues of government and culture. Even in his time of sorrow, Jesus set the example by employing the blessings that were at hand to feed the hungry masses. The church is called to team with God to satiate the spiritual starvation that is prevalent today and address the standards that God has set for life. So as we consider feeding spiritual truths to a community that hungers for God, reflect on these questions for introspection, if you will. Question number 1, how is your church promoting a Christian world perspective on current social issues of abortion, marriage, and family? Question number 2, what fish and loaves contribution might you be able to make in addressing the spiritual hungers in our communities? And question number 3, how can you resist the human urge to withdraw and grieve in private when Jesus is calling each of us to feed the spiritual issues in everyday life? Surprisingly, most churches avoid advancing a Christian world perspective on the most pressing social issues of the day. When confronted about it, pastors respond that they fear speaking about Christian values and biblical truths on potentially divisive issues such as abortion, same-sex marriage, because that could offend certain members of their congregation. That would be nothing new for Jesus. He experienced times when some of his followers took offense and actually left. Let's take a look at John 6:6. You and I have been placed here for a time such as this. It's not by accident that we've been born at a time when the world desperately hungers for spiritual truths. Our contributions may seem as paltry as 2 fish and 5 barley rolls to feed thousands of people, but whatever we have can provide the beginning acts of faith that can have the effect that is more than what we could ever imagine. See Ephesians 3:20. Our human inclination may be to retreat and to pray to God, asking him to change the course of the world. But he's given that responsibility to us. He has directed us to become the salt to the decaying culture and light to extinguish the darkness of the evil one, Matthew 5:13 and 14. Of course, it is good to go to God in prayer, but we need to be asking him what he wants us to do, what he wants us to say. Our contribution may seem insignificant. The picture we paint through our actions may be a primitive painting. Nevertheless, we are called to feed the spiritual hunger of the day. We need to be bold. Start with what has been given to you. Step out in faith, providing food to feed the spiritual emptiness of the day, and God, no doubt, will multiply your efforts.